en Nuevo Sol Televisión.
A master's also and a PhD in sociology. So I wanted to begin the presentation by talking a little bit about my background before I begin to speak about my research. And so I am sharing with you some pictures from my family. So the one that you see to the left is my entire family, my mom, my dad, and there's actually 7 siblings. So I'm the 6th of 7. I'm the one little one down there in the bottom with a white dress on. And then to the right is a picture of all of my siblings and I when we, as adults. And so my parents are both from Mexico. So my mother, she was born in Ciudad Juarez, but her family is from Jalisco. So they immigrated up to the border to Ciudad Juarez. And my mother, she came to the United States when she was 3 years old. And my father, he is from a town called Jalostotitlan, Jalisco. And that's where he was born. And he came to the United States at 13 years old. And they went up to, I'm originally from Sacramento, California, which is in Northern California. And they went over there because of, just like a lot of families that immigrate, they usually go where their social networks are from, or where they have social networks, and also where there's work. And so a lot of my tias worked in the canneries up in Northern California, in like the Campbell Soup Factory, for example. And then my dad, he did a lot of work, but one of the first things that he did in Northern California was work in the field. So he picked onions and tomatoes. And so my parents, they met over there, and then we, there's 7 of us, all my siblings were born there. And I put the title of this slide, Family and Skin Color, because I wanted to tell you a little bit about my family background, but also about skin color. So, I see, as you can notice, we're pretty fair-skinned. And that's relevant to talking about Blaxican identities and experiences, because growing up, and I know this is not a unique experience. I think a lot of Latinx people experience the whole issues that have to do with skin color. But I remember growing up, my dad's side of the family that are from the town Jalostotitlan, Jalisco, which is, I've never been there myself, but apparently there's a lot of people that live there that are very light skinned. They have, blue eyes, green eyes, and blonde hair. And I remember growing up, my dad and my uncles, they would always brag about their family members in Jalos that looked, European, or they looked white. And so, you kind of heard all that growing up. And then also family members that would use terms, in Spanish to talk about skin color. And so like the positive, and there was a positive connotation and also negative connotation depending on what the term is, right? So, for example, some of those terms like güera, güero, there's, when you hear that usually, or somebody calls you that, usually that's seen as like a compliment. It's a positive. And then there are other terms that are more derogatory, right? So for example, like, I have a family member, no one in these pictures, a different family member that would use the term India or Indio whenever their kid did something like mischievous. And it was like it was like a negative, like a insult, to say that. And so I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you haven't possibly already heard. But I come from my family, a Mexican family, and you did hear a lot about like, it seemed like they valued more the European aspects of Mexican identity, and they devalued the indigenous aspects, and didn't even acknowledge the African aspects at all. there was never a conversation about, we, Mexicans or Latinx people in general will have African ancestry, African roots. There's a complete denial of that. Even people who identify as Mexican and do have some African ancestry, in their physical appearance, also deny it. I know people that such as who've had that experience, and I know that they were teased growing up, and there was always this like denial of or even acknowledgement that there was any kind of African ancestry in among Mexicans. Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward. So growing up in that context, I had my son. This is my son Emilio. He's my oldest child, who's now 19 years old. But I had him when I was a freshman in college, and I actually was at a Cal State. I went to California State University, Sacramento, and I had him my freshman year, and I raised him as a single parent, pretty much from the very beginning. And so being a parent of a child who I identify as Blaxican. So this is Blaxicans are people who have one Mexican or Mexican American parent and one African American parent. And not all people who have that parentage identify themselves as Blaxican or use the term Blaxican. And this was not a term invented by me. I'll talk more about the interviews that I did with people in the United States, but it was not something that I invented, something that I heard of though. And so when I gave birth to my son, I should start with when I was pregnant with him, I did have some family members that were upset because I was actually the first person in my family to be in an interracial relationship. My dad was disapproving, but the way that he explained it was that it was because of religion. So he said, I grew up Catholic, and my family, they're Catholic. And for him, he would always just ask me, what religion is he going to be, And my son's father and his family, they actually are agnostic. They don't practice a religion at all. But the assumption was that, I don't know what my dad thought they were, maybe Baptist, I'm not sure, like as a stereotypical image. But he used the excuse of like religion, what religion is he going to be? And, I remember pointing out to my dad one time, I said, Dad, we have cousins that are darker than if it's about skin color, I don't know. I have cousins that are darker than my son's father, And so, there was just disapproval. I had one of my brothers that I grew up with living in the same house. We were actually very low income. So at the time, my dad, we were on food stamps, welfare. My dad wasn't working. We were living in renting my uncle's house, 2-bedroom, small house in Sacramento, the house my parents still live in now. And so I lived in that house while I was pregnant. I was a teenager with my siblings, and one of my brothers, he refused to talk to me the whole time I was pregnant. We lived in the same house, little house, and he didn't talk to me at all the whole time I was pregnant. And then when I gave birth to my son, all of my siblings came to see me at the hospital except for that one brother. But when I came home, I brought my son home. And, like after you give birth, like it's difficult, so you ask for help. And I remember one time I asked my dad if he would hold my son while I took a shower. And every time I get emotional every time I tell this story. But when I got out of the shower, my son was laying on my brother's chest, the one that never talked to me the whole time. And I'm not trying to say that my son's birth changed their anti-Black attitudes, but I did notice something in them that did change. And I'm not, you know, like people say, oh, multiracial people are like the solving racism, right? I'm not trying to say that that's what that is, but I did notice that there was something that did change in my brother, because after that, he, you know, they growing up, like, look, I'm sure everybody has some kind of awareness of this, but Latinos, and I'm going to say specifically Mexicans because that's what I am, and I'll speak from that experience, you know, are anti-Black. There's a lot of anti-Blackness. There's a lot of, you hear it a lot, you know, people openly talk like that. And so I had in my own family, they would. And after my son was born, at least I didn't hear it from them anymore. I don't know. I hope that in their heart they have changed, but at least they knew better not to talk that way in front of me. So I also had some family members that would, like when he was born, they said, oh, he's so dark. I also had a cousin who suggested after my son was born that because his nostrils are a little wide, that I do, like, you know, rub his nose like this and keep doing that, and that would make his nose narrow. And I remember looking at her and saying, you know, that's how his nose is supposed to be, and I'm okay with it. And then the other thing I told her was, if that actually worked, we wouldn't have plastic surgery. So thank you for trying to do that favor for me. And she was being 100% sincere. Like, she thought she was actually giving me good advice, like not a joke, not funny, but giving me like solid advice. And so I also had another cousin who told family in Mexico that that his father is Puerto Rican, which is not true. And that kind of speaks to that racialized hierarchy. So in my uncle's view, it was better to say Puerto Rican than to say Black, you know, because of the way that we categorize people into these hierarchies of which one is more valuable and which one is less valuable. Okay, so, and now I have we call ourselves a Latino family. So this is actually my husband, and we're a blended family in many different ways. So we had children before our relationship, and we also have one together, which is the little boy in the blue that's being carried by my stepson. That's our son together, but all of my family members are in some way Black and Latino. So two of my stepchildren are Costa Rican and Black, and then the others are Mexican and Black, and then one of my stepsons is actually white and Black. But we are, a blended family. This is us, and this is the way that we experience our lives in LA. And it's pretty interesting because we live in, I live in Somar, and this part of the Northeast San Fernando Valley is very Latino, right? It's like predominantly Latino. So we have some interesting experiences with, depending on where we're at, honestly, we don't really get a lot of looks unless we're in certain parts of the valley. Like, for example, like certain parts of Northridge. Sometimes when in the west end of the valley, people stare. Over here, they don't stare too much. It's well, I'll talk more about the personal experiences a little bit later. But I wanted to move on to the research. And so the chapter that you read, that was based on my dissertation research, which I'm actually turning into a book manuscript right now, and it hopefully will be published by next year. But what I did was I interviewed people who are Blaxican, who have one African-American parent, one Mexican-American parent in the United States. And so I did a total of 40 interviews. All of them were adults. And that had to do with, in sociology, we have to get approval through the, what is it called? Institutional Review Board, which is like a very rigorous permission to interview people. And so it's easier to interview adults than it is to interview children because of the permissions. I mean, it wouldn't have been impossible, but I went with adults. And most of the people that I interviewed were from California. However, they were also part of 9 other states, including New York, Indiana, Georgia, New Mexico. Like I said, their biological parents are African American and Mexican American, and they consider themselves to be the first generation multiracials. And what that means is that we all know that we're all quote unquote what they would call racially mixed, right? There is no such thing as a pure race in terms of biological. But what I mean by first generation is they consider themselves to be the first of that mixture between an African American parent and a Mexican American parent. This is different than Afro Latinx experiences and identities from Latin America, or let's say Afro-Mexican, for example, who people that are Afro-Mexican in like places like the Costa Chica region of Mexico, they've had multiple generations of this mixture, where Blaxicans are more, they consider themselves to be more of a first generation racial, and their racial formation is specific to the United States. And I'm sure if you have questions, we could talk more about that and what that means. And then I just want to talk about this picture that you're seeing. So these are actually children from my family. And the mural that you see in the background is actually Saint Padre Toribio Romo, who is supposedly, according to my father, somehow part of his relation. And he's a patron saint of immigration, I believe. And he is from the town where my dad was born, Jalostotitlán or Santa Ana, I believe, which is like a little village right outside of it. And so this is in my uncle's backyard. One of my cousins, he's a muralist, so he painted that. And I just thought, I took that picture a long time ago, but I thought it was an interesting connection because of, here you have descendants of the Romo lineage, right? And they're Afro, or they're Blaxican, Black and Mexican. So just a little about the emergence of Blaxican identities. So in the United States, in 1967, there was a US Supreme Court case that legalized marriage between people of different races. So all the way up till 1967, which was not that long ago, there were laws in different states in the US that prohibited people from intermarrying with one another if they weren't from the same race. So after 1967, there was an increase in interracial marriages and also multiracial births. As I've said before, this idea of multiraciality is not something that's new. It's a social construct. It's just an idea, that people believe to be real. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's always been multiracial people. It's just that after 1967, you had more that identified themselves consciously as being multiracial. So Mexicans also started to migrate out of the, y'all can't see that little box that popped up, can you? Okay, good. That's just my computer, so I'll ignore that. So Mexicans started migrating outside of the Southwest, which is the traditional place for migration, into places like Georgia and Indiana and New York. And that kind of set the stage for these interracial marriages between Mexicans and African Americans, because Mexican and African Americans tend to work in the same kind of industries, low wage labor, working in. So for example, this is an actual respondent that I interviewed, and his parents, he is from Indiana, and his parents met working at a factory in Indiana. And so his mother's Mexican and his father's African American. And so they, moved to the same neighborhoods, they worked in the same places. And so that kind of just set the stage for these interracial marriages and multiracial births. So also Blaxicans started to, or with the increase of these multiracial births, they started to identify outside of what we call Black according to the one drop rule. So in the United States, there were laws on the books in different states that said that if you had any amount of African ancestry, that you were legally designated as Black. And then it became more, not so much a legal construct, but a social construct. Anybody who has any amount of African ancestry is socially designated as Black. And that's why we can look at former President Barack Obama, who has a white mom and a Black father from Kenya, and look at him and say he's just Black. Nobody looks at him and says he's white, right? Because of the one drop rule. And so Blaxicans, they kind of represent this moving away from identifying as Black using the one drop rule, which is the way that a lot of people who were mixed with Black previously would identify, because not just like, well, legally, and also because of socially, that's how people viewed who is Black. Okay, so my research questions centered around, I wanted to know how people identified and why it was that they were identifying in the way that they did. These are all pictures of family members, children from my family. And at the time when I was an undergraduate, before I went to grad school, I only knew Blaxicans that were children from my family. And so I wanted to learn more about that. And I was also interested in Black Latino relations generally. And so when I went to UC Santa Barbara, I met became my mentor, and I'm actually co-authoring the book with now, G. Reginald Daniel. And he was one of the first people to teach a class on multiracial identity at UCLA. And so it kind of just all fell into place when I went to grad school. I didn't really know that's what I wanted to research, but I had a Blaxican son, and I was interested in looking at Black Latino relations, and it kind of just it fell into place. And so just, there's only a couple more slides, and then we can have questions, but just a couple of the things that I found, and you've read the chapter that your professor provided you. But I found that Blaxicans identify, or the ones that I interviewed, they identify as both Black and Mexican, regardless of what their appearance is. Because some Blaxicans have more of an appearance that people mark them as Black. And then you'll see in the next slide, sometimes I've interviewed people who either are perceived as racially ambiguous, or they might fall more towards people perceiving them as being Mexican or Latino. And so regardless of physical appearance, they identified as both Black and Mexican. And they also saw Mexican identity, not just in terms of an ethnicity, which is how the US Census categorized who is quote unquote Hispanic, is as a culture. They also saw it as a race as well. So they viewed themselves as both racially and culturally Black and Mexican, which on the next slide, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. But the picture that you're seeing here is a woman that I interviewed, Enadina, and her mom. And so she is from Indiana. And actually she's the sister of the other person I was talking about on the previous slide. And so that's their mom. And their parents met, like I said, at a factory that they worked at together in Indiana. So this is Guillermo, a person that I interviewed. He's actually a twin. His twin brother, they're fraternal, they're not identical. So that was really interesting because they both had these very different experiences based on their physical appearance. Because Guillermo, if you can look at his picture, his hair is straighter, he has lighter skin. And when people look at him, they didn't perceive him as being Black, even though his mother's Black and his father's Mexican. And so he would do things like in college, like he joined a fraternity that was a multicultural fraternity. And there was these different strategies he said that he would use to let people know that, he was not just Mexican, but Black as well, And so it was really important for him, for people to know that he was both Black and Mexican. And so it's something in the book that I write about, some of the strategies that they use to not only embrace both being Black and Mexican, but how they represent that to other people, or how that is become so important in their lives that they do, things like, for example, like hair it was a very, a topic that people talk about a lot, not just the women, but the men as well. And so like wearing their hair in certain kinds of hairstyles, growing it out, putting it into dreadlocks, that kind of represented the African or the Black side of themselves. And so Guillermo said, I usually say I'm Blaxican because I don't want to deny both of them. So I always say Blaxican. Off the top, people already know what I'm talking about. So Blaxican becomes like this easy way for you to understand that they're both Black and Mexican. And there's other terms that people use as well, like Afro-Chicana, Afro-Mexican, even though it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as when we think about Afro-Mexicans from Mexico. It's a little bit different. Okay, and so ways that they learned about their hybridity, or this mixture of not just racial identity, but also cultural identity, was through their parents. So my parents exposed me to both my cultures through music. So they talked about music a lot, the different kinds of music that their parents listened to. We ate soul food and enchiladas. So also talked about like the different kinds of food that was served on the dinner table. And it wasn't like they always, like a mixture of both at the same time, but one day they might have eaten, collard greens. And then the next, week, their mom prepared menudo or something. Something that I found really interesting, though, was that many of the respondents that I interviewed talked about how their African-American parent actually spoke Spanish or knew how to cook menudo. And so there was a lot of this cross-cultural exchange that was happening in their families that was just really normative. It was just normal. And then there was also, navigating anti-Blackness, which is something that when I started the presentation, I talked about it from my own experience. But this is Latoya and her mom, who's Mexican. Her father's African-American. She was raised primarily by her mom and also her grandparents, who are Mexican and only speak Spanish. So she said, my mom always made it clear to me to talk to me about why I was different from other people. My grandparents helped raise me and they didn't speak English. I had episodes of kids calling me names, calling me the N-word in elementary school and even junior high. I had my grandpa who told me that I wasn't Black, but Mexican. And so that was a pretty common theme that came up, especially on the Mexican side of the anti-Blackness. I don't think that Latoya's grandfather was trying to tell her that she wasn't Black in a way. Let me rephrase that. I think he was more trying to instill a pride of being Mexican, but at the same time, he was denying her Blackness. And I say that because it's really complicated, and it's very nuanced because she talks about her grandparents in a very caring and loving and compassionate way. But at the same time, having to deal with comments that came from her grandfather, and having to constantly negotiate that. And then having always like her mother who was on her side that just instilled this pride in her of being both Black and Mexican, not feeling ashamed of being Black, but giving her, encouragement to embrace her Black identity. And so this is kind of, just some of the nuances that you find in the whole negotiation of what it's like to be both Black and Mexican. And then I know, because I don't want to take too much time and I want to give some time for Q&A, but I wanted to just end this part by talking about where I started, which is about my experiences with my son. So this is on the right-hand side. He would probably hate that I am using these pictures right now if he knew. But on the right-hand side, he turned 18 last year, and this was actually him right after he voted in Michigan, which is where he's at in college right now. And so I was really proud of this picture because the first time that he voted, and he had to stand in line for 2 hours, talk about voter suppression. um, on his birthday. It actually was on his birthday that he voted. And then the other picture is him and I when first time I went to go see him play soccer in Michigan, or his first time I saw him play soccer in college. And so just a little bit about our own experiences. I raised him mostly in Southern California. I went to get my master's and PhD at UC Santa Barbara. And then we moved here to Southern California, to Sylmar, actually, when he was probably like 8 years old. And so I grew up in Sacramento. It is segregated, but in my opinion, it's segregated mostly by class, not by race. And when I moved to LA, this is the 10th most segregated city in the country. And so it was a different experience coming and living around predominantly Latinos, which is what my neighborhood is. I think we're like 90% here. And so the experiences with him going to school was that a lot of Latinos, his classmates, they didn't see him as Mexican, not even as half Mexican. Even if they saw me drop him off and talk to their parent, and like, they never saw him as that. He has been called the N-word. I would say starting in fifth grade was the first time that he was called that by Latinos. That's the thing too, is like it's very painful, when people from the group that you see yourself as being a part of are the ones that are hurtful in that kind of way. And I'm not trying to say Latinos are the only ones that are like that, because we know there's a lot of anti-Blackness in every single group, right? That's not Black. But there was like he experienced a lot of anti-Blackness. And that was painful as a parent, because, as a parent, I wanted to go up there to the elementary school. And, what you feel is that you want to go and pull on a little kid's ear or you want to talk to their parents, or you want to do something. But, my husband always calmed me down. And okay. So, he experienced that. And then he went to Sylmar High School and played soccer. He was on the soccer team. And that was an interesting experience too, because while they were his teammates, and now him playing soccer and being an athlete, it's been very eye-opening, because he's been called the N-word also, like on the soccer field, not by his own teammates, but, by other teams. And so his freshman year at Sylmar High School, there was actually a fight. And some of you, I don't know, it was on the news. I know there's a lot of things on the news, and it was a long time ago, but there was a fight it happened to be between African-American students and some Latino students. So it kind of turned into this like racialized event in sort of a way, where it had to do there. I have to be honest. It was like supposedly involved a gang. And so the gang supposedly put a quote unquote green light on all the Black students, which a green light means that when you see them on site, to actually it means kill them. And I don't know if it was all that serious, but some kind of violence, And it was, him being both Black and Mexican, it was really difficult kind of time to navigate. A lot of the African-American students actually ended up leaving the school, and then some of them ended up staying there. But I do remember I canceled all of my office hours after classes to drive all the way from Santa Monica to Sylmar to pick him up after school and drive him home, because I didn't want him walking through the neighborhood. My husband says I exaggerate, but it's because he lives here. He's been like, he grew up in Pacoima. So, he has a different experience. But for me, it was like, I'm not going to take any chances. And I wasn't the only parent that felt that way. Latino parents and also African-American parents, we were both worried about our kids. And there was actually well, y'all can ask me more questions about that. I won't go on and on if you're curious. But one of the reasons that I did this work, and I like to share this work, is because Mexicans in particular and Latinos in general we're not aware of the African ancestry and African roots that we have. And the more awareness that we have of that, I think the less kind of anti-Blackness and discrimination and prejudice that we have towards one another, with, the more awareness that we have. So a lot of people, like, not even, sometimes even Blaxicans and other Latinos, they don't even know that we have, Afro-Latinos. They don't know that Afro-Mexicans exist in Mexico. They don't know that Mexican culture is actually influenced by African culture in a lot of ways. One of the most famous songs that people recognize, which is La Bamba, which is, made famous by what they started calling him Richie Valens, which is right here in the San Fernando Valley, is actually a song after this African tribe called the Mbamba. And so the song is actually originates from people who were enslaved, Africans that were enslaved in Veracruz. The Zapateo, which is a dance step, ethnomusicologists, they've traced this dance step, which is like the tapping, right? If anybody's ever danced folklorico, you learn to do that dance step, and it's actually an African dance step. We can trace that back to Africa. Also food and, Latino culture, and specifically in Mexican culture, supposedly agua de Jamaica. And then one scholar, he actually argues that even Mexican rice, the cultivation of rice, actually comes from Senegal. And so there's so many things about Mexican culture that has its roots in Africa. And we don't recognize our relation, right? Because of the history of colonization and imperialism and slavery that has taught us that the worst thing that you can be is Black, right? And the devaluation of Blackness, when actually, if we look deeper into the roots, Latinos have, African ancestry as part of their, not just physical, embodiment, but also in the culture itself. So with that, I will stop talking, and then I'd love to hear your questions or comments and have a conversation with you.
Well, first, thank you so much for sharing your experience, right, and for helping us understand a little bit more about Blaxican identity, right, and how significant it is, and how new in terms of racial formation, not because it hasn't existed before, because it has, right, but now we have a way of talking about it, which I think that makes a difference. It's really interesting that you talked about Los Angeles as a heavily segregated city, right? I'm a director of an archive, a photo archive of mostly Black photographers. And one of the most interesting things that you can see in the photos is really that the spaces that were designated for non-whites were multicultural spaces, actually. We have photos back in the 50s, I think, so, of schools here in Los Angeles, right? In South Los Angeles that are multicultural. You can see Mexican kids next to Black kids, next to Asian kids, right? And some Jewish kids as well, which were not at the time clearly defined as white people, right? But Los Angeles remains a very segregated city, right? I have folks that had come from Texas. I studied in Texas, right? And they say Dallas is segregated. It's nothing like LA. So I'm happy to hear that you have. Well, I'm not happy to hear that you have that experience, but I'm happy that you can recognize that experience, right? Which is hard to see from people that live all their lives in Los Angeles. And now I'm going to open the questions for the students. So I don't want to invade their space. So who wants to start? Brian, you want to start?
I actually, after reading your article, I had a question because you spoke about how the reason why a lot of the some of this anger, like different, like people try to stay within one group, for example, they either want to be Black or Mexican, or their family members pushing to be one ethnic or racial group. It got me wondering, if these new, I don't want to say like these new people, but if Blaxicans are trying to preserve maybe a new culture that they have created themselves. So, for example, I know that if you're Mexican, you have, the traditional views, you're Catholic, you're X, Y, and Z, and then if you're Black, you have, it's just, they're different groups, obviously.
Mhm.
But once you're Blaxican, do you feel like you have a new culture, like that you want to preserve? Like you don't feel like you fit in because you have something new? I hope that makes sense. But
no, that's a good question. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, well, I would say that some, and I'm not I don't think you can generalize, right? Because everyone that I spoke with, they had kind of differing views and different experiences, but there were definitely a couple of people that I talked to who do think that Blaxican culture is a new culture, is something that, is different than anything else and is very unique, and it's a blending of both Mexican culture and African American culture. Some people, and I would say like some people, multiracial people, would actually reject that type of characterization because they feel that it's essentializing another group. Like when we talk about, in the chapter, I talked about Black authenticity and Mexican authenticity. And so if those are just ideas that a group of people agree exist, and then it becomes real in its consequences. And even people who are Mexican deal with that, right? With authenticity. Like, for example, if you don't know how to speak Spanish, you're not seen as authentic, right? Even within those communities, there's those questions about authenticity. And so I guess to answer your question, yeah, there are some Blaxicans that do think that like Blaxican culture is its own unique culture, but then there are others that don't think that you should essentialize and put it into another category, in another box, because that limits the way that we understand or accept human experience. And they would rather people see like human experience to be more complex and nuanced and complicated, and not just in these neat little boxes like we do, right? Yeah, so thank you for that question.
Sorry, I muted myself. Somebody else wants to ask a question?
Yeah, I had a question. I know you were talking about, especially from experience, right? And then you're talking about how your family was not accepting at first, and then when your son came along. But do you feel like, especially in the Latino and Mexican community, as long as it's not happening in my family, I don't care about it. It's I'm that exception in a way. But once it happens to them, they kind of open their minds to it. They're stubborn about it, but once it's happening to their families, they're more open to talking about the issue, or getting to be more open about it.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Luis. Yeah, I think that it's probably like any other thing, right? I mean, you could think about people who within a lot of different communities, not just Mexican community, there's a lot of homophobia. People don't accept those that are LGBTQ. And then when someone in the family, it's kind of this, I would say it's the same thing in a way. Not until there's an interracial marriage or a multiracial birth in the family do people become more open-minded about it because it's happening to their family. But at the same time, what I did find with some of my interviewees is that they were completely rejected from, especially the Mexican side of the family. There was more, from my interviews, what I found is there's more acceptance of interracial marriage and multiracial births in Black families than there was on the Mexican side of the family. Mexican side were more likely to reject the family member who had an interracial marriage or interracial relationship. Some of them didn't talk to their Mexican side of the family at all because they were just completely rejected by them. there was only one person that I interviewed whose Black side of the family was not accepting of her Mexican parent. And in fact, her grandmother, and I think I might have talked about it in the chapter, but she changed her name to, because they named her a Spanish sounding name, and then the grandmother legally changed her name in middle school. Okay, not even as like a baby, but already after you're used to your name and that's your name and everything. And her grandma changed it legally, or had the mom change it legally to a non-Spanish sounding name. And she said that it was because she thought that she would get discriminated against less. So here this African-American grandmother believes that the granddaughter will have easier time if her name sounded Anglo, even though physically she had African ancestry, and people look at her and just think that she's Black. But in the grandma's eyes, having a Spanish name was worse. And I'm not trying to do the oppression Olympic thing and say which one is worse and which one's not. They both carry, like a burden, or, people see you in a discriminatory way. But yeah, those are the types of things that, some of the people I interview, what they experienced. But thank you for that question.
Thank you. Just want to follow up on another question with what we're talking about before I forget. You were talking about the 1% rule, right? Like, is if you have any Black ancestry, like you're considered Black. I personally did not know about that rule, and I found out because of your presentation. Why do you think that's like more spoken about and more mentioned in media? And like, even if you're 1% of Black ancestry, like you're considered Black, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think that's not more talked about?
That's a really good question. So the rule itself actually originated in the South, and this was during the institution of slavery. There was a lot of this interracial mixing going on, as we know, because of the history of the U.S. history, that it was due to mostly like white men that were enslaving Black women, that were raping them, and then they were having, reproducing, having children. And so there was like a lot of racial mixture that was going on during the institution of slavery. And anyone with any amount of African ancestry was automatically considered to be a slave, right? Like if you had any amount of Black ancestry, that automatically designated you as a slave. So you needed to know all of the intermixing kind of like confused things, right? And they wanted to make it very clear, if you have any amount of African ancestry, you're a slave. So that determined who was free, who was not, who could own property, who could not, who can own a gun, who could not, who could marry a white woman, who could not, right? It was about protecting white power, white privilege, supremacy, and prestige. And so white people during that time in the South made a law that said anyone with any amount of African ancestry is going to be Black. And this is why, right? It was about protecting this idea of white racial purity. White people can only own property. They're the only ones that can own, have a gun or whatever, right? Everything that gives them privilege and prestige, right? They wanted to make it very clear who was white and who was not. And so there's a book called Who is Black, and by James Davis. And he actually it's a historical book, and he goes through like because in different states, it was like in, let's say, Louisiana, it was like 1/8. You had to be 1/8 Black to be considered Black. In like Georgia, it could have been a different percentage. And then eventually those laws were taken off of the books over time. And then it became not like a legal construct, but a social one. So everyone just associates, if you have any amount of African ancestry, you're automatically Black in their minds, right? And actually, the United States is the only country on the planet that uses the one-drop rule to determine who is Black. Because in other places, let's say like Brazil, for example, because of all of the racial mixture that's happened in Brazil, if they use the one-drop rule, the majority of Brazilian society would be considered Black, but they don't, right? So we're the only country in the world that designates who is Black using that role. Yeah, and there's so much more.
Thank you. That's
yeah.
interesting.
Thanks for
question.
asking the question and for answering. Melody, also, guys, if you want to have a question, and I want you to have a question as much as you can, as much people as we can fit in, send me a direct message so I can call you next. Melody.
Yeah, hi. So I had a question. You mentioned within the paper and also now within your presentation about the 40 individuals you surveyed, but I was a little bit curious about the process and the selection and how you came to interview them and like why them.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so I actually started it off with my master's thesis, and then I extended it and continued on with my dissertation. So this was a while back. So one way that I recruited people was by using, remember, I don't know if any of you know MySpace. Are you too young for MySpace?
They are too young for that.
No way. I love MySpace. MySpace was so
I remember MySpace, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The best.
So MySpace used to be able to put your own songs, and like you kind of had to either know how to copy and paste actual code. And it would have these graphics on your page and stuff. You can't do that anymore with Facebook. But anyway, the way that I recruited in people to interview was through MySpace, and also I used Craigslist in the volunteer section. So I asked for people, people if they were interested to get interviewed, and then I put that information out there, and I gave them my, information like my email, and then I waited for people to contact me back. And then I also used like word of mouth. So I sent emails, I think, to a couple of colleges and universities and asked them to send them out to their students. And I was actually pretty surprised because there was a lot of people that actually reached out to me, even though I know 40, you probably think 40 is not a lot, but I was surprised actually that many people got back to me and actually wanted to talk. And I think with, identities and experiences like Afro-Mexican, Afro-Latinx, or Blaxican, it's very invisibilized. And we don't, it's not brought to our attention. So people are very eager to talk to you about their experiences because no one's ever asked them before, or it's just, something that no one really thinks about because as I mentioned in the chapter, we live in a very monoracial world, right? Like the way that we understand race is only through these really narrow categories of experience: Black, white, Asian, Latino, indigenous, right? And then on the census, they don't even use all of those that I just listed as racial categories, but that's kind of the way that we look at things. And any category that is kind of like this in-between category that's not Black or white, it's gray, right? It gets it gets erased and we ignore it. Also, human beings were really dichotomous thinkers, or very binary thinkers. So this is true for not just race and ethnicity, but also like gender and sexuality, right? You're either heterosexual or you're gay. If you're bisexual, right? If you're a person that inhabits an in-between space, people don't pay attention to you, or they don't take you serious, or they laugh at your experience. They don't validate you, right? And so that's true also of like multiracial people, or people who are Blaxican, or people that are Afro-Latinx as well, is that they might see themselves as belonging to all these multiple worlds, but those worlds don't accept them. They don't see them as part of them. And so that's why I think people were really eager, to talk about their experiences. And I hope that answered your question. I don't know if it was just about recruitment.
No, it did. I just, I think like since we're embarking on this project, and also we want to like reach out to people. So I think like, I guess sometimes it seems to me that people might be like a little apprehensive about opening up. So I think, yeah, that brings like, I don't know, more ideas, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a good point. And what in my research, well, because of the IRB, and I think journalism is different. I'm not sure, but I changed their names, so they're pseudonyms. I don't use their real names. Also, even though I use MySpace, I think now on Facebook there's actually a lot of Blaxican groups, and I do think people are very willing when you reach out to them to want to have those kinds of conversations. Also on Instagram, there's a hashtag called Blaxicans of LA. And then Walter Thompson Hernandez, he was a former graduate student at UCLA, and now I think he does some journalism for the New York Times, I believe. And he's Blaxican himself, and he actually started that project, Blaxicans of LA. He has like a whole photojournalism project on Blaxicans in LA. So he might be a good resource as well. On Instagram, he's, I'll put it in the chat, at my Chivas. I don't think he'd mind me giving you his Instagram handle since he has like thousands of followers.
Yeah, and he has a podcast too. He had a very moving
Oh yeah,
episode.
he does. That's right, he does.
A very moving episode. We're probably going to listen to that. Speaking about his mother, right? His relationship with his mom.
That's right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Diana, you're ready?
I think so. Well, here's the thing. I've been trying to articulate the question, but more than anything, I want to explain like the context of the question before I can ask the question. I don't know if that makes sense. But last year we all saw the whole George Floyd incident, and the movement really rose up, the Black Lives Matter movement. And it wasn't until then that I saw, Latinos really like uniting with Black people. And it so much so that I actually saw a post of like the Mexican and Black president that we had in Mexico. And I just want to know, like, in your opinion, why do you think like it's barely coming into light, this whole like multiracial thing, when it's been around forever?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's my question. Sorry.
No. Well, did you have more? I'm sorry.
No, that was it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a really good question. If you look at the past movements from the civil rights era, like the Black Power movement, Chicano Power movement, I think that those movements were very essentialized in the way that activists organize were usually around their own racial cultural communities. But there was some overlap and there was some coalition building, which I don't think we focus on enough. It wasn't like people were not doing that back then. I think right now we're just in a moment where people have become more aware, and I want to say younger people too. Like I always tell my students, I'm not radical enough for them, and I'm not trying to say that like in graduate school, I thought I was all radical. And I don't want to say that, I always, I feel like I always could be doing more. But when I went to Santa Monica College, I learned working with like students and student activists that I'm pretty sure I'm not radical enough for them. They have pushed beyond where I'm at, if that makes sense, and I think it probably happens to all of us at some point. But the thinking, I feel like on young people is just more intersectional. And by that, I mean more, they're able to critically think more of how our struggles are interrelated and interconnected. And, so it's not just about one group struggle. It's people, young people, I feel like are seeing more of how our struggles are connected together. And one way I do think that the reason that that's happening is social media. you know, older generations, MySpace came out when I was in grad school. That was my first social media. I was already 21 years old, 22 years old, the first time I interacted with social media. And so social media allows us to see what's happening in other parts of the world that do not relate to us necessarily on a direct level, but we can actually see what's happening somewhere else and then make those connections about, oh, wow, people in Ferguson, Missouri are facing the same kind of oppression as people in Los Angeles, California, right? And I can see that on my computer screen, right? And I can connect with that. And so I don't know, I probably didn't answer that question very well, but I just feel like social media is a way that has connected young people in a way that they can see beyond or through these boundaries that we are kind of all live our lives in, and we can actually connect with be more empathetic towards other people and see how we're the same as them, even though we might be a little bit different. I don't know. Why do you think? I'd like to hear what you think.
I don't know. I don't really think I have an answer to it, but social media would definitely be it. I find it so trippy that I've been living on this earth for like 25 years and I'm still learning about things that are part of my culture as well. And it's weird, and I also think like another question that you might not be able to answer or Professor Benavides might not be able to answer, but like, are people in Mexico, why aren't they bringing it up as well? You get me? Like in terms of why isn't this a bigger topic than it should be?
And by this topic, are you talking about the George Floyd thing or about like Afro-Mexican identity?
Afro.
Oh, okay. So interestingly, okay, so let's talk about that. I think in Latin America and places like Mexico, there's anti-Blackness because it's rooted in the whole history of the nation states, right? So you had like imperialism from European nations and colonization. So Europeans like the Spanish coming to Latin America and to Mexico specifically, and enslaving people from Africa and enslaving them in places like Mexico. And so this whole like anti-Blackness is related to the history of slavery, right? The history of enslaving people from Africa and those ideas that were brought with that as Black people being inferior. And so in Mexico, in Latin America, there's like this narrative that is told about race, and that is that everybody is the same, right? And that there are no differences, but we know that there are differences because indigenous people in Mexico and Latin America are seen at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. How do we know that? Look at their living conditions, right? Look at the resources that are denied to them. They're usually the ones, actually not usually, they are the ones that are living in most poverty. There's prejudice and discrimination against them. Bobby Vaughn, who's an anthropologist, he argues that, and he studied Afro-Mexicans in the Costa Chica region in Mexico. And he argues that if you were to put like people in a hierarchy, like groups, that mestizas, people that are seen as like the mixture between indigenous and Spanish, they're like the dominant group in Mexico. And the lighter skin, the higher up, right on that hierarchy. And then he says that Afro Mexicans are actually higher on the social hierarchy than indigenous people, even though they're Black, even though they're mixed with Black. And he says this because Afro Mexicans, they speak Spanish. A lot of them are Catholic, right? And then indigenous people may or may not speak Spanish, but they also have their own indigenous dialects, and they may or may not be Catholic, but they also have their own religious traditions as well. And so they're seen as non-normative, right? Afro-Mexicans kind of assimilate and blend more into Mexican society than indigenous people do. And so there's that hierarchical ranking that happens in Mexico. And so going back to your question, I think that like Mexico and Latin America, they just erase. There's an erasure of Black African ancestry and African culture, in Latin America, and it has to do with this, like, well, gosh, we can even go farther back and talk about the casta system. There's a lot to it, but it's related to that history as well, because the casta system was the ranking of people by the Spanish, and the higher you were ranked, the more Spanish blood that you had. The less Spanish blood you have, the lower that you are ranked. So all of these things carry on into the way that people conceive of race, in Latin America today, and it carries on these consequences. Oh, but I was going to say that in Mexico, I think last year or the year before that, they actually added Afro-Mexican onto the census. Mm-hmm. So in that, I think, is a direct result of Afro-Mexicans themselves collectively organizing to be recognized by their nation. And that's what we usually see even here in Latin America, is like people at the top are not going to just give marginalized and oppressed people their rights. Usually it's the people that organize themselves in order to demand those rights. And you're starting to see that in not just Mexico, but all over Latin America with different Afro-Latinx communities.
All right. Thanks, sorry that I went on a full rant on the questions, but thank you.
No, you did not. I did. I went on a rant.
Camille, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. This one's from the chapter. I wanted to know why you think, or why issues surrounding identity were more difficult and frequent for Blaxican women than for men. Like, I don't know if the answer was in there, but I just didn't understand it.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So Blaxican women talked a lot about, I think because it has to do with the intersection of your gender identity and everything that came along with it. Wasn't just about their racialized identity, but also like the intersection of that and their gendered identity. So in the chapter, I talked about how like they were exoticized by men. And so exoticized, made to feel exotic, otherized. And so they just had a more, I would say, just different types of challenges than men did. So when I interviewed men, I mean, it wasn't that they didn't have challenges, but I would say that their challenges are different. For men, it was more like being perceived as just a man of color in general, and then having to like deal with what it means to be a Black man and also a Mexican man, right? And so in our society, those often are devalued or they get criminalized. People see, Black and Latino men as criminal. And so having to like negotiate those kinds of things. But for women, it was more like negotiating being exoticized, or being sexualized is something that they talked about a lot, And so for some people who might be hearing that thinking like, well, how is that not a positive thing? But for them, it just added another layer onto their experience of being a woman, and also what it meant to be like a Mexican or a Black woman at the same time.
Thank you. And then I also wanted to thank you for sharing your story and your background. I have one more question, a personal one, so you don't have to answer if you don't want, but you had mentioned that you raised your son as a single parent and he lived with you in your household. It was a Mexican household. Mm-hmm. So like from what you know of him, like how did he, like at school, what would he like, who would he hang out with, like
yeah,
I don't know how to ask that question, but
yeah, so that's, I'm still learning about him. I still ask him these kinds of questions. Because just because I'm his parent doesn't necessarily mean that I know, right? But he identifies as both Black and Mexican. So if people ask him, what are you? He says, I'm Black and Mexican, or Blaxican. And then when we moved to LA, it's predominantly Latino, like all the schools he went to. So a majority of his friends were Latino. And but then I asked him actually like a couple, when I was writing the book manuscript, because I wanted to like get some insight, and I asked him, how, because I had a couple of, I think in the chapter you read, some people say, oh, I feel more comfortable around, and Mexicans, or I feel more comfortable around Black people, and this is why. So I asked him, and it was surprising because majority of his friends are Latino, but he told me he feels more comfortable around Black people because, and I asked him why. And he says, because they don't ask him questions, or he doesn't have to explain certain things, where with like his other non-Black friends, they ask him questions like, why do you wear, like he used to wear this, I guess it's called a do-rag, right? And to make his little waves. And, so they would ask like, why do you, and it's not like it's offensive kind of questions, but it's sort of like we all just, when you're with your friends, it's like they know who you are. You don't have to explain anything. You feel comfortable around each other. So it's like that, I guess for him. But yeah, the majority of his friends are actually Latino though. So.
Curious. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thanks for answering that question. And I think it's somewhat similar of a question Elizabeth had, but she had problems with connection. So I put it on the chat. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. So Blaxicans choose both racial identities rather than choosing one, but it seems like there are moments that push people towards one more than the other. Monica had that folklorico, for example. Do you think that multiracial people ever stop having moments like, you know what? I don't think they do. I don't think that they do. In Northern California, if you look at the census, there's actually a research report that was published that said it looks at the number of people that mark 2 or more races on the census, and Hawaii actually is the state in the United States that has the most people that mark 2 or more races, and then California, I believe, is the second. But Northern California had more counties in Northern California, like Sacramento and the Bay Area, with people that mark 2 or more races versus Southern California. And so there's actually some really interesting research that a woman that I went to graduate school, Alyssa Newman, she's actually doing research up in Northern California, interviewing multiracial people. And it's what she's finding is very interesting because in some places, being multiracial is now being considered more normative. Like if you go to a high school where there's a lot of people that are mixed, it's actually becoming something that's like more normative. People don't question as much. So I think it might depend like on the kind of the context that you're in or the space that you're in. But like I mentioned before, given that Los Angeles is the 10th most segregated city in the nation, I think people who are multiracial probably experience a lot more of those kinds of interactions where people are asking them to choose or to like prove that they're authentic. So I guess to answer the question is, I think I don't think that's ever going to stop happening, but it might depend on the context you're in. It might happen more or less depending on the context.
Thank you for answering the question, Liliana. Now we have more questions. They're getting into the conversation. Liliana?
Yes, so I have a question. So I was reading your the article yesterday. So why is it that you think that Blaxicans get discriminated against, like among their 2 racial ethnicities, due to their hair texture, skin color, Spanish fluency, or hip hop dancing? If not all Mexicans or African Americans within, like among themselves, they don't have the same skin color, hair texture. They don't even have Spanish accent, for example. I'm Mexican from both my parents. I'm actually lighter than my sister. I have straight hair, she has curly hair. So why is it that you think that Blaxicans, they get discriminated against, their ethnicity, the 2 different ethnicities, if we're not all the same?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And you're right. I mean, even though, people that consider themselves, they identify as Black or they identify as Mexican, and they're not, as far as they know, mixed with anything else. They still face these authenticity questions where people ask them. You know, I usually get people who think that I'm Persian in LA. So depending on where I'm at, like if I go to North Hollywood, for sure somebody is going to come up to me, or they think I'm Armenian as well. I've had people just straight up talk to me in Armenian, and even when I looked confused, they thought that I was pretending like I didn't know what they were saying. I was like, no, I really don't understand you. I'm sorry. But there's an article written by a sociologist named Heather Downledge on what she calls border patrolling, where she really tries to get at the root of why, for example, if you're why she's okay, so she looks at why white people what she calls border patrol. And by border patrol, it means like authenticity, like you're trying to, when someone is outside of what you consider to be authentic, there's those constant questions. And so she looks at why Black people border patrol other Black people. And she says that it's related to our ideas around embracing certain kinds of identity in the face of oppression. If you're not authentically Black, you're seen as disloyal to the racial struggle against white oppression. And so that's why there's a lot that's at stake, you know, to identify as Black and to be loyal to being Black is because there's so much at stake, right? And when like there's a lot of people that think that if, let's say you're Black and your you have a parent that is Mexican, there are people that criticize those that say that I'm multiracial or that I'm Blaxican because they want you to only identify as Black, because they see you as trying to like move away from Blackness and to avoid racism when you identify as something in addition to Black. I mean, I've even personally been confronted by somebody, I'm not going to name who they are, a very well-known person who is a leader of a movement, who criticized me for raising my son or telling him that he's both Black and Mexican, right? Because in their view, if you're Black, you're just Black. And they see it as like you're trying to move away from Blackness. You're just ashamed of being Black. That's why you say that you're Black and something else. But what it is in reality is not shame at all. There's a lot of pride in both. It's actually that you're just acknowledging your other parent. You're acknowledging the fact that even though you're perceived as Black to the outside world, you grew up in a Mexican household. You were raised in a certain way. You hit piñatas at birthday parties. You ate menudo and pozole, whatever it is, right? Like you actually had those kinds of experiences. That's who you are in your core. But just because you look Black, people don't accept you as that. For Mexican border patrolling, I think it has a lot to do with just anti-Blackness, right? Not accepting people that look Black into what you consider to be Mexican because of anti-Blackness, right? Not wanting to associate with anyone that, or acknowledge that being Mexican also includes Blackness or having African ancestry, because that people think that that's shameful, you know, they're ashamed. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question. And sorry that was so long-winded.
No, it was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering that question. And I think Lily also posted it in the chat that she's been also confused as an Armenian.
I actually had to learn about Armenians, you know, like their history and who they are, because before I moved to LA, and I'm like, I need to know how people are perceiving me, you know, so. Yeah.
I live in Glendale, so I've learned a lot about Armenia.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you're ready for your question?
Yeah, I actually have two questions. One is regarding your article, and one is like a kind of personal. What do you think in the perspective of a sociologist? So my first question is, Blaxican tend to struggle to feel either enough Black or Latino. So how do you think people can start approaching one race without leaving behind the other race?
So I think the way that people do that, and based on my interviews, is by embracing both, right? And that even regardless of what their physical appearance looks like, embracing both, acknowledging that they are both. So it's interesting because even people that I interviewed that were raised by just one of their parents and only exposed to one side of the family, whether that was the African American side or the Mexican side, culturally they would. So let's say, for example, Latoya, the woman that I showed you that was with her mom, she was raised by her Mexican mom and grandparents, and they spoke Spanish. She was very, they were very, as she says, traditional. And so culturally, she viewed herself as a Mexican, but people perceived her as Black. But she identified as both Black and Mexican. But culturally, she identified more as Mexican. But I think one way that they don't leave the other behind is by reinforcing that and telling people that they are both. And also she did things like when she was in college, she joined a Black sorority. So when the other quote unquote side of them was missing from their upbringing, there was things that they did to try to learn more about that other side and incorporate it into like who their self-identity, how they view themselves. So it wasn't it. Now there can be people that do just embrace one, but I didn't interview them, and it probably was the way that I recruited them. I was asking for people who were both Black and Mexican. So you're not going to get somebody who's Black and Mexican but only identifies as Black or only identifies as Mexican, right? So that's what we call like our maybe the way that we design our research. We can recruit a certain person that is only going to think in a certain kind of way based on how we try to recruit people. I don't know if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
It does, yeah. I have another question. This is regarding, you mentioned the castas before. So this is something that I always had in mind. Now, since we're creating more and more labels, we could say labels of people. Do you think that by creating more labels or more race, we're going backwards? Would you think that would divide more the country because now we're fitting more people in certain criteria instead of like just as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in my research, and actually, if you look at the research on multiracial identities, you see more of an embracing of different. So, for example, Black and Mexican, but non-hierarchically, more egalitarian. So not valuing one over the other. So even though, yeah, the label could create this other category that kind of, as people say, divides, if you actually look into it, it's more of an embracing on an equal level, like not seeing it hierarchically, not seeing Black better than Mexican or Mexican better than Black. It's actually embracing both of them. So even though it is a different label, if we can actually learn from it as a way of kind of being actually more equal than what we know of right now. I don't know if that makes sense. But that not everyone thinks that we should create those labels. Like a lot of multiracial people reject being labeled as anything. They just, when you ask them, what are you? They'll say, I'm human. Even though when people look at them, they're not just seeing them as human, you're seeing them as something, and they get treated as, what they're being perceived as. But they reject the labels altogether. There's a lot in common with like gender and sexuality studies as well, like gender, or as people say, label. There's people that are gender non-conforming. They don't want to conform, or they don't conform to either, masculinity or femininity. They see themselves as more of a blending, or I don't know what it is, not as much like a rigid category.
Thank you. I think you made perfect sense. I think the idea of castas is really an idea of turning people into a hierarchy, right? The wider you are, the better you get, and and these emerging identities are not necessarily about putting somebody above the other, but creating identities that really represent groups equally, right? And that make people identify themselves. I think is great. It's great what you're studying, and obviously it is different. Thank you. We have a student, Kelly. Kelly's a student from, and she was her hand raised. And this will be probably the last question because Dr. Romo needs to leave soon. But Kelly's from geography. They're trying to create a project with us as well in geography, talking about this issue. So she's parachuting in our class, and she's a great student. So Kelly, you're on.
First of all, I really want to thank you for this. Today's talk is very informative, and I learned a lot. And I have a question. It's like more about the realistic question, because I know, like, for the minorities, we try to promote the social equality. So there are a lot of like social support, like for different type of racial group, like some scholarship just for Black population or some scholarship just for Latino population. So I wonder, how do you solve the problem? Like, because I know like Blaxican, they identify themselves like both African, like the descent of the both African and Latino. So what if there's I can't say hate, like what if people think that, oh, you are taking advantage from both group, and that will create like more social, I can't say hate, like, you know, you will feel why it's like that, you can take the advantage from both group. So people might think, I don't want you to like identify yourself like from both group. But if they don't, they actually, because there are not a lot of social resource just for the Blaxican, that certain group. So for that certain group, they will feel like, I'm discriminated. I can't get enough social resource. So how do you address this problem?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the whole reason that this idea of race came about as a social idea was for social, economic, and political reasons. And originally, like when we're talking about the one-drop rule, it was a way for whites in the United States. And this is, if you look at different countries, it's going to be a different type of story. I mean, similar story, but different actors. Okay. But in the United States of America, it was white Americans during, you know, the whole formation of the United States, actually as a result from the institution of slavery, that kind of created this concept of people of being different races, right? And it was all about maintaining white racial purity. So everyone else was otherized in comparison to whites, right? And so originally it was a way of like separating people to maintain white power and supremacy. But eventually people embraced those labels and categories. And there is a hierarchy, there is a ranking of that. And if you look at the US Census, over the years, they've labeled people differently, right? So like at one point, Mexican Americans were considered white in the United States, right? And in fact, we're not considered a race right now, we're considered an ethnicity. So we don't really get categorized as race. And the census was created as a way of enumerating people to distribute resources, right? Is pretty much like the main point of the census. People think that the census actually created race categories, or that people benefit, from their racial categories, but the census actually gathers that data in order to distribute resources to different groups of people. So just really like in a nutshell, to answer your question, is that in 2000, the year 2000, the census came up with that category where you can mark 2 or more races for the first time. And there were a lot of people, in particular African Americans, that were upset about that, because if, let's say you're black and white and you mark that you're black and white, they felt that the category black would lose numbers and less resources would go to the black community. So one of the things that the census did was that if you mark 2 or more races, that you get enumerated in the non-white category as a way of making sure that like those groups of people don't lose resources. And I don't know if that was clear or not. And I was just trying to rush through it because I know that we have to we have to go. And I hope that was like,
well, we can stay longer, but obviously you have to. You said I'm just going to be able to do it until 1. So, but I think you did answer the question. I think you really addressed the question. Don't you think, Kelly?
Yeah, I feel that addressed my question. I just thinking about like a smaller scale, but if you think of bigger scale, I think it's just the next step of achieving those social equality. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Romo. Can I ask you just one last question? If the students have other questions, can they contact you either via email?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll put my email in the chat. But yeah, absolutely. You can contact me via email and be happy to answer any questions or.
As they have other questions, probably what they do their research and they try to reach out to people, right, to do interviews, etc.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no
well,
problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for all of your questions. It was a great class. Thank you so much.
It's a great group. I always get lucky. I always get the good students. I don't know my colleagues, but